So hi everyone, my name's Elina and I'm from the Irrational agency in London, and what I want to talk about today, or tonight as it's now exactly midnight in London, is applying behavioural economics in different cultures and start to look at how we're all irrational, yes, but in slightly different ways. And just to follow up on Jeffrey's sort of personal introduction as well, one of the reasons I'm fascinated by cultural differences in psychology is that I'm originally from Finland and have lived most of my adult life in another country. So that's been an excellent setup for observing how people think differently in different countries. Slight delay on slides. So let's start by just have a quick outlook of why this is important. Three reasons, really. The first one is that, as everyone has probably noticed, there's a huge increase in research in Asia and Latin America. Especially in Asia, we're already starting to realize that some of our existing methodologies in consumer understanding can't really be exported in a straightforward way. Now, secondly, while quant researchers have sort of long accepted that survey research is affected by culture through phenomena such as acquiescence bias or extreme response styles, cultural differences actually have far more diverse and wide-ranging implications for both marketing and market research. Now, and finally, and most importantly, why this is an important thing to talk about right now, is that behavioural economics is being enthusiastically adopted across the market research industry all over the world. Researchers everywhere are applying these insights from decision-making science and sort of wholeheartedly embracing the concept that we're all a little bit irrational. But I think it's important to ask or think about whether we're all irrational in the same way. Can we really think of behavioural economics as truly global? Well, that's what we're going to take a look at. Now, I appreciate there's a lot of stuff on the slide, but just bear with me, or either listen to me, or you can read. So, much of the research on and decision making that's in the public realm through pop science books such as Predictive Irrational or Nudge, a lot of that's actually been conducted in Western countries and particularly in the US. What that means is that we're sort of assuming that all of these cognitive biases and heuristics are pretty much universal and unaffected by context. However, there's a slight hiccup because 96% of the samples in psychological studies come from countries only 12% of the world's population. Put it another way, a randomly selected American is about 300 times more likely to be a research participant in these studies than a randomly selected person from anywhere else outside the West. Now, these countries in that 12% are commonly referred to as WEIRD, which stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich and Democratic, which makes these countries really unrepresentative as a sample in psychological research. On the whole, we don't really know yet a lot about cross-cultural differences in BE, and the biggest reason for that is that all these theories in decision-making rarely consider culture as a factor, because cognitive researchers, they largely assume that while what we think about, that might be different, but how we think is pretty much the same wherever you are. Now, given the emphasis of many of these decision-making theories on the impact of the immediate context, such, for example, framing or priming, it's quite surprising how little culture has actually been taken into account. Now, as Professor Dan Ariely says, the biggest challenge for behavioural economics in the next 10 years is to understand the generality of the findings that we have now, and actually, he thinks that we've been ignoring culture far too much. And I would agree with him, because apart from anything else, exploring these biases and heuristics in different cultures, that can really help us understand the underlying psychology a bit more deeply. Now, before we go any further, we should probably define quickly what I mean by culture. So, despite a lot of long-standing debates in academia, there actually isn't a commonly accepted definition of culture, which you might find a bit surprising. Instead, researchers tend to focus on those aspects of culture that are relevant for whatever they're interested in investigating, or the phenomena or their area of interest. So, but when we're sort of colloquially talking about culture, we're usually referring to aspects such as values or attitudes or social norms, all sorts of beliefs and traditions or rituals. Most of these are studied by social psychologists, who actually know a whole lot about how cultural context affects us. And that's pretty well accepted by both academics and us as practitioners as well. But how about the cognitive aspects of decision making? Surely they should be the same everywhere, right? Well, let's take a look. What you can see on the screen is something called the mullah illusion. Take a look. Which one of the two lines seems longer to you? In case you're not familiar with it, the reason it's an illusion is because both lines are actually exactly the same length, yet the other one, the one on top, seems to be longer. Well, at least it does to most of us, and probably all of us listening today. If we look at some data, which you can see now, that's on the chart. You can see that's an index of the magnitude of that illusion in an experiment that was conducted in 16 different cultural contexts. The vertical axis that says PSE stands for point of subjective equality, which is a fancy word for just showing you how differently people see the length of those two lines. The longer the lines, the more different you saw the length. And what you can see is that there's a really big difference between these populations, and the American undergraduates in Evanston, that's Illinois near Chicago, as in Evanston near Chicago, they're at the extreme high end, and whereas the other end you can see sand foragers in the Kalahari Desert, which are pretty much unaffected by this illusion. Or it's actually not really an illusion for them at all, because they just think the two lines are the same length. Now, when you look at that, you might start to think that the US sample that's supposedly so representative of the human race suddenly looks rather weird. Now, I appreciate that that might seem a little bit anecdotal evidence for you. I mean, foragers in the Kalahari Desert are hardly a big market for air fresheners and laundry detergent, right? Well, there's plenty more where that stuff came from. Just to give you a couple of quick examples of some large-scale studies that, in this case, are focusing on time perceptions. And so, one study in 45 countries found that there are huge differences in how we discount time, or in other words, how much we value the present much more than the future, and that's influenced by not just wealth and education, but also cultural factors like individualism and time concepts, such as, for example, linear or cyclical view of the time. Linear concepts see time as going from point 1 to point 2, which is very common in the West, and cyclical is much more common in the East. Another study that came out recently looked at the relationship between language and how we see time, and found that actually the grammar of languages correlated with really unrelated things like savings levels and health indicators. So in short, there's no shortage of evidence that shows how economic and social and linguistic environments they really strongly shape people's behavior and motivations and preferences. Now, I don't know about you, but to me it seems pretty clear that that the cultural context does indeed make a difference. But if you try to hold on to all that information about all those different countries, like 45 or 76, is a little bit too much. So what we need is a framework, and there are actually a couple of really useful concepts which can help us understand how cultural context affects the way we think. The three main factors that affect how all of these different biases that behavioural economics has uncovered, how they work differently in different countries, we can split them into three ways. So, firstly, the way people see themselves, or their self-concept, how they process information, and then finally other effects like differences in time perspective, as we've seen earlier. Now, the first two are linked, so today I'll just focus on those ones to keep things a little bit more clear. Now, as a starting point, let's imagine that the world is divided into two poles, individualism and collectivism. Some of you might already be familiar with these, but let's go over them quickly for those who are not familiar with them. So, in a country such as the US and many other Western countries, and probably everyone who's listening today, or at least the speakers, because I don't know who else is listening or who is listening, people see themselves more or less detached from relationships and community, and also see themselves as independent of others. Now, I realise that that may sound strange, and you might even think that you have close relationships with your community, for example. That may well be true, but these differences only become clear in comparison to to the other end of the spectrum. So compared to the West, in countries such as Japan, people will define themselves through their relationships and status within the social system. It's much more difficult for them to separate how they see themselves from their social context and their social lives. Just to note at this point, I'm going to be focusing on East and West because that's a clear distinction in the academic literature, and it also makes it easier to kind of map out these differences. But there are a lot of different shades of well, irrationality, I suppose, within Europe or within the Americas, for example, or within the different countries in Asia. But let's stick to these ones for now. Going back to this bipolar world, for those of us who have grown up in the individualistic West, it's quite natural to define ourselves through our internal attributes. In fact, we don't just define ourselves with adjectives like friendly, assertive, driven, and trustworthy. We also define brands that way. Just think about all the brand personality lists that you include in all your questionnaires. For us, everything is coming from the inside, and we see our behaviour as driven by that internal world. On the other hand, if you've been brought up in the East, you're much more likely to see yourself as, for example, a loyal daughter, a hardworking employee, or a trusted friend. So in other words, through your relationship with others, and you'll also see your behaviour in a much more contextual way and strongly affected by the situation that you happen to be at the time. Just to pause for breath for a second when that slide changes. So in a nutshell, the self-concepts act as a lens through which we look at our lives and look at the world. They organise the information we have about ourselves and the world around us. They direct our attention to information that we see as relevant. They shape our motivations and how we evaluate situations and how they make us feel, and so on. So they're quite fundamental things in our lives and also for in psychology. So even though they sound like a little bit, these two types of cells are actually more like a sliding scale rather than different buckets that people can just be slotted into. Sort of more of a continuum between a self that's more independent or more interdependent. If you're more at the independent end, like most of us today, we'll see ourselves as sort of self-contained individuals, autonomous agents, a sum of the parts, and the parts being our personality traits and abilities, and most importantly, consistent across time and different social situations. You're kind of the same person at home and at work. On the other hand, if you're at the other end, the interdependent end, you're more likely to see yourself as an interpersonal being with lots of obligations to others within your social group, and it's natural that you come across very differently in your different social contexts. So where people find themselves in this continuum has huge consequences for all sorts of emotions, cognitions, and motivations. Now, at this point, I've been going on about all this, these cells and different poles for a while, and you might be asking yourself, what on earth does any of this have to do with B or let alone marker research? Right? That's a very good question, and we'll just about to come to that, so hold on. Now, one of the key things that we focus on as researchers is what consumers are likely to choose, because that's really what marketers are interested in. So let's take a look at how the way we see ourselves affects our choices. It's probably safe to say that most of us, in the West at least, would agree that what and how we choose says something about ourselves, and somewhat maybe reflects our values as well. An example of this would be that we might like hybrid cars because we see ourselves as environmentally conscious, and buying that car will show other people that they're part of ourselves. It also makes us look a little bit different from our friends and our neighbours who might drive a regular car. Is choice really an individual act, a reflection of our inner attributes like we've seen before? The thing that we don't often realise is that underneath all of this, this assumption that choices reflect who we are, is that uniqueness and being different from others is something that we should strive for, and that sort of makes choice almost a duty in Western concept. Now, you're probably wondering, what do you mean? Well, if you think that being unique is something that is worth aspiring to, you probably want to put a lot of effort into differentiating yourself from others, and one way of doing that is showing just how much effort you're putting into your choices. In other words, how much variation is there in the things that you buy? All of this really makes choice into an act of self-expression. It's all about how expressing our true being as such. Now we're coming on to the B finally, so we might be thinking. So when choice is something that you do to express yourself, it becomes a really important thing. And that in turn makes the psychological impact of either lack of choice or a failed choice that much bigger. So that in turn then leads to different psychological strategies. One of these strategies is known as diversification bias, which is a key concept in behavioral economics. Research suggests that people tend to seek variety in both how and what they choose. What the research shows is, what the diversification bias shows is just how unstable our preferences or our likes are. And this bias comes up when people, for example, have to choose now which of 6 snacks they might want to eat in the next 3 weeks. And when you ask them to do that, they tend to pick more kinds of snacks than when they choose once a week which of 6 snacks they want to choose that week for 3 weeks. So in other words, when you ask people to predict their choices or make several choices at once, they tend to diversify more than when they're making the same type of decision one after another. Now, rationally thinking, there's no reason why those 2 choices should be different, because if you like Twix or Mars bar, you know, why would your choices be different if you're just asked to make the decision in a different way? Now, the problem is that the majority of this research on this bias has been done in a Western countries, specifically in the US, where personal choice is almost a key cultural value. Now, on the other hand, in collectivistic cultures, choice is often an interpersonal task, which means that the success or failure of making a choice that shows yourself in oneself in the most positive light is not as big a concern. Now, subsequently, recent research has shown that this diversification bias is actually much, much weaker in these cultural contexts, which means that you don't actually see as much of this tendency to make lots of different choices if you ask people to predict in advance. That's really relevant for us as market researchers, because one of the things that we often ask people to do is project what they might buy in the future. And can we really assume that all those repertoire questions that we have in our surveys, that they're really comparable across different countries? The other thing that self-concepts also affect is the strength of another well-known B concept, which you might be familiar with, the endowment effect. And the endowment effect, oops, we're going a bit too fast. The endowment effect is where simply owning something makes it seem like worth more money than if you didn't own it, so that owners value objects substantially and rationally more than potential buyers do. The reason that the endowment effect works or why it's happening, is because owning an object activates an association between the object and yourself. And actually, thinking about it from the Western focus of self-enhancement, that means that the association sort of transfers how much you value yourself to how much you value the object. So it automatically boosts the value of whatever it is that you own. So you might assume then that the strength of the endowment effect is influenced by the degree to which self-enhancement is a cultural value. And in fact, some recent research suggests that the effect is a lot stronger in a Western concept. In practice, that means that sales tactics like free trial or bait and switch, they might be a lot less effective in non-Western contexts that have a weaker endowment effect. The final way in which self-concepts affects our decisions is through our thinking style. The original research that discovered this found that looking at a video of an aquarium, people from Western culture focused much more on the salient objects such as the fish, whereas people from the East spent much more time describing the whole environment. They call the former style analytical, which goes with a more independent self, and where you're because both are focused on parts rather than the whole, and holistic, which goes with a more interdependent self, that's more focused on relationships with either people or things. Now let's look at quickly how that affects us. If you think about price, that's sort of long been seen as a true marketing universal. It's sort of widely assumed to be seen as that's a signal for quality, and consumers think that the higher the price, the better quality. And in fact, research done in a range of Western countries suggests that there are indeed very few cultural differences. Well, essentially what that's based on is that price influences these quality judgments, and that price is separate from elements like the product itself, its design, or its ingredients. Now, if you think of any concept test or MPD research project you've ever done, you can probably see that even as researchers, we see price pretty much in this way. Now, again, some new research that came out this year suggests that, in fact, the type of self-concept you have influences how strongly you associate a product's price and its quality. And what it says is that those with more interdependent self-concept or a more holistic thinking style, which is more prevalent in the East, is more likely to evaluate products in this more holistic way, which makes price a much stronger quality cue. So how do you use that? Well, if you first of all, if you know that consumers in a particular cultural context are more likely to evaluate products in a more holistic way, you can assume that any kind of framing effects may be more effective. And secondly, knowing that, you might also then think that you should probably connect pricing research more closely to any MPD work that you're doing in certain cultural contexts. Now, I did actually want to share some research that we've done at the National Agency on specific behavioural bias. So what we did a little experiment. We ran a little experiment across 11 countries across the world with the help of John Pullison at GMI. And so sunk cost, if you don't know it, it's also known as sunk cost effect, is like money down a drain. So if you already spent money on something, that shouldn't really affect whether you decide to, or how much money you spent on something shouldn't really affect whether you could choose to invest in it again or anymore. And what we found was that, first of all, we took an experiment from a really key study in the 80s, and we slightly adapted it from a ski trip to a concert ticket. There's two concert tickets, one's more expensive and one's cheaper. And what you find is that after you bought both tickets, the cheaper one is for an artist that you enjoy more. And you realise that they're both for the same day, and you will have to forego one of these events. And rationally thinking, you should go for the one that you enjoy the most, which would be the cheaper one. But then, if you're falling prey to the sunk cost effect, you should be more likely to choose the more expensive ticket because you spent more money on it, even though it doesn't really matter. You've spent all the money anyway, and you should just go to the one that you enjoy most. Now, what we found was that actually sunk cost effects seem to be quite a lot smaller than it originally was, as you can see from that. So from 54% to 32%, which is possibly because it's been almost 30 years, and it's a very different sample, not just undergraduates, but a NatRep sample. But it's quite interesting that went down quite significantly. And the interesting thing from a cross-cultural perspective is that there are huge differences between the countries that we're looking at. And looking at the chart, you might think that, oh, right, okay, well, those ones at the top are the countries that are not necessarily at the wealthiest end of the spectrum. But what's interesting is that you can see China at the very bottom, and there's really no psychological theory that would explain that. And for us, that was quite interesting and quite frustrating, but also quite interesting in a sense that it just shows that these huge differences between different countries suggest that we can't really assume that any of the biases that we're looking at in behavioural economics, that they work similarly or are equally strong in different cultures. And as Richard Dale often says, even he doesn't know, even though he's the grandfather of economics. So even he doesn't know for certain whether something's going to work or not. So that's why we always test and do research. And certainly this would suggest that that's a good idea. And so, as sort of just to sum up, the three key things that I'd like you to take away from today is that understanding these cultural influences on thought and decision making is really crucial for anyone who is trying to accurately describe and predict what consumers are going to do. And secondly, all the findings and theories in behavioral economics, they might be universally applicable, but without an in-depth knowledge of specific cultural contexts, it's difficult to find effective applications. And finally, cross-cultural research in behavioural economics is still very much in its infancy, so there's no off-the-shelf solution similar to predictably irrational or nudge, and you really have to sort of put a lot of effort into understanding the potential impact of culture on decision-making. And as a final thought, now that we're sort of gradually abandoning this thought of rationality and adopting more principles from BE, I think it's important that we make sure we don't put in another mistake, or another mistake, and that of universality.